Hi,
Hi,
Rose.
Eddie. How are you?
I'm great.
Good.
I am so delighted to be in conversation with you. Thank you for making the time.
I feel the same way. Thank you.
So, we are having this conversation
Mhm.
against the backdrop of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. It is against the backdrop of COVID 19.
Mhm.
And I think it's also against the backdrop of a really profound reevaluation of leadership.
Mhm.
Leadership in the private sector, in the public sector. And I've been reflecting a lot about representation,
Mhm.
specifically equality, and really asking myself, what is the difference that difference makes? I'm a firm believer that our differences are our superpower. And I am so delighted to have the opportunity to serve on Verizon's Disability
Yeah.
Advisory Board. And I think that there are so many exciting conversations right now about how we really move the needle
Mhm.
on difference, on intersectionality, on inclusion. I'd love to get your thoughts broadly about what you think the difference is that difference can make.
Yeah. So I love that question because I
Mhm.
think there's so much inside of it that we can sort of unpack, right? I mean, first, if you start with the core of leadership, it's a muscle. And I think
Mm,
if you are in any type of leadership capacity, you have to remember that you can't be a stagnant leader, that
mm-mm,
you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to learn from those, and you have to be able to continue to evolve and to develop. And so, as you evolve and develop, then you ought to want to have a listening ear
mm,
and to include points of view that might make you uncomfortable or
mhm,
that you might not are aware of.
mhm,
And I think this whole view around what is inclusiveness, too often, Eddie, everyone talks about, oh, the stats show when you have a more
mhm.
inclusive leadership team, the businesses do better, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
And what I keep saying is, well, no one's making decisions on those facts, right?
right.
They are blocking it from a point of emotion. They are blocking it from a point of what am I comfortable with.
Mm,
And so you have to be able to get underneath sort of what makes you uncomfortable, and then as a leader, grow to a point of being comfortable and embracing a dialogue and embracing people around your table who are going to challenge you and who are going to have a different point of view because, you know, there's nowhere in my life where I just want to talk to myself.
right.
And if everyone around my table is me, then what's the point? So you
Yeah.
want to be in a place where people are giving you a different perspective and challenging your thinking and helping you to see what inclusiveness needs to look like
Hmm.
because they are from that community and can help you intimately understand.
Right. You know what? So much of what you're saying resonates so deeply. And I love what you said about leadership being a muscle,
Mhm.
right? That we need to practice leadership
Mhm.
time and time and time
Mhm.
again until we get better.
Mhm.
And it makes me realize also something you said around decision making that we like to think it's this sort of objective, that we take decisions based on data only, right? But it really is about emotion and vulnerability. And so I guess I'd love to hear from you. How do we have a more nuanced conversation about inclusion, and an honest one, right? So a conversation that recognizes that it is emotional, it is in many ways psychological and sociological, right? And that it's not the reason why we're not seeing the kind of progress
Mhm.
that we need to see is
Mhm.
because we're not having that honest emotional conversation about how decisions get taken, and people wanting to feel comfortable with folks that they know, right? And so how do we have that conversation?
I think you said it because
Mm,
I think there's some key components of what you have indicated. So, first of
mhm,
all, we're in this season where
mhm.
every company, business, everyone talks about bring your whole self to work.
Yes.
Well, when you bring your whole self to work, you got to get really comfortable with what people bring because
Hmm.
all of us are messy, complicated people with messy, complicated lives. And so when you bring your whole self to work, you bring that person to work. And that opens up a place of vulnerability, and that opens up a place where you have to be willing then to learn and to listen and to understand a person's why. And most people don't want to focus on anyone's why,
Yeah.
right? They just want to focus on, this is not what I expected of you, change it, get it done, as opposed to, tell me what's going on here.
Right.
Tell me why. Let me understand. What are you reacting to? And sometimes what you're reacting to are these deep-rooted issues where you've seen this movie play out over and over, and there is pain associated with it, or there is joy associated with it. And there are things that you could use to help further a business's agenda or a group's agenda, and people have to be willing to allow that to happen.
Right.
I think the other thing is we have to allow people to bring their whole selves to work, and that means allow them to tell the truth. Because what I've found is that so many people have their hidden disabilities and they don't want anyone to know. So many people have issues and they don't want to say it. And I think that if you're asking people to come into the space with wholeness, then you got to create an environment where they're willing to be authentic
Bingo.
in what they deal with. And that opens up the door to a much more inclusive environment and a much more openness to what people look like who sit at the tables.
I love that so much. And what that makes me think of, Rose, is that we need a new methodology, right? We almost need a new way of practicing leadership, right? In the sense that, I often say that intersectionality is a methodology. It's not just a synonym for diversity, because it's become this buzzword that we use, recognizing, intersection, that we all embody a multiplicity of experiences and identities at the same time. But I think it offers a methodology too, right? It gives us a tool, a framework for how we do business, right? For how we sort of live our lives, right, in the world of work. As you're saying that, bringing our whole selves to work really demands that we listen, that we give space for people to be authentic and truthful and honest about who they are, but also that those perspectives can actually drive greater value and drive greater innovation. Maybe that's the invitation, right? The invitation of inclusion and intersectionality is about new modalities, new ways of doing what we do.
What do you think those new ways are? Give me an example.
For example, I think that this is where disability becomes an offering, right? I've made this example before that, I said it time and time again, and I'll continue to say it, that as a wheelchair user, I know that what makes a space accessible is not a ramp. A ramp may facilitate entry into a building, but what makes a space accessible for me is the dignity, the joy, the liberation, the sense of belonging that I feel once I'm in that building, right? That it's about all identities coming together to feel celebrated and validated and productive. And beyond that, I think that if there's anything that COVID-19 has taught us, especially around like remote working, et cetera, is that there are many ways to get the same thing done, right?
Yeah.
That as I use voice dictation software to do all my work and all my emails, and that mode, right, that methodology for being able to deliver on a project, that I may do it in a different way, but ultimately I'm still able to get the same result, right? And so I just wonder if we center the lived experiences of people with disabilities, not just in terms of representation, but really, lean into disability for insight in terms of how we redesign the way we work, that therein perhaps lies an opportunity for innovation. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, right?
Okay.
I mean, I think you and I talked about this once before, just
Yeah.
with thinking about what, our little earbuds mean to
Right.
us, right? Whereas before it was, if you were a member of the deaf community,
Yeah.
you were always walking around with earbuds.
Right.
But then you use that to drive innovation. And I think what gets in the way is being uncomfortable in just asking, right? In asking, what do you need? Or asking you more questions to understand the world that you live in, because we get uncomfortable when we don't know, we don't want to say the wrong thing to someone,
Yeah.
we don't want to ask the wrong question. And so as a result, we retreat into
Yeah.
our little corner, into our little world, into our space where we're comfortable, because it's hard sometimes to just say, Eddie, what does this mean? Or talk to me
Right.
about this, or explain this to me. Yet you're so open and willing to, because you can see how it can help solve a bigger problem. How do we change leadership so that there is a willingness to just ask the question?
Yes, 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 1,000 times to everything you've just said. And you know what? You're right. There's nothing wrong with getting it wrong, but there's something wrong with not asking out of fear of getting it wrong, if that makes
Oh, I
sense,
love that.
right? And so you've made me think about that, and reflecting on your question about how do we get leadership, I think maybe it's time we expand our definition of leadership to include vulnerability, right? That leaders are vulnerable, because I think even in an institutional setting, I think we still hold on to a definition of leadership that is masculine, that is of a particular demographic, right? But we haven't expanded our definition to actually include all of these things that we're talking about, right? That actually make, I read somewhere the other day that leadership is too important to be left up to leaders, right? And I thought that's a very cheeky way of saying it. And therein sort of lies, I think, the nub of it, that it really is about reimagining leadership to mean all of these other really important things about authenticity and truth and vulnerability. So if we get leaders to embrace their own vulnerabilities, their own differences, then that might make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's that embracing your own differences
Yeah.
and being willing to tell your story in a way that can bring people forward. My husband has, a major disability driven by a medical condition that happened when he was like 49, so prime of his life, and then these things happen. And so for me, it's been very interesting going on the journey with him and really learning how to advocate for him, how to be there for him, how to meet his needs. And the hardest thing I had to do was bring that to work. To let people understand that I was going to make different career choices and just live my life in ways that put him first. And that meant a willingness to not do some other things, right? And I try to live that out loud for people around me so they can feel comfortable making similar decisions, and that we can be better as a company of making sure that we're not just doing it for our employees who have someone at home, but for our employees who need to be here, and hiring and developing and ensuring that we have people in this company whose needs we are meeting in that regard. So it's really been my little silent advocacy that I've been doing for a number of years to make sure that it's understood.
I love that.
But I shouldn't be so silent, is what you'll tell me.
I love that. So I have the great joy of serving on Verizon's Disability Advisory Board, and I guess I'd like to ask, why disability? Why has Verizon done this? It's sort of, the least sexy of the topics as far as inclusion and diversity and equity is concerned, but as a company, you've taken this decision to lean into disability. And I love speaking to you every time about this topic, but I'd love to know sort of what the rationale behind that is.
If you think about the fact that 1 billion people around the world live with some type of disability, we have to be able to harness that view that you have of disability, innovation being two sides of the same coin. And as a technology company, then we want nothing more than our technology to be at the core of the types of solutions that are being developed, right? And that's what 5G and the promise of 5G is how do we leverage that technology that is a game changer in terms of the proficiency of what networks can do, what that means in terms of a lack of latency, what that means in terms of the experiences that can happen in the medical field, right? That can happen in education, that can happen across all industries, that can happen in transportation. it is a game changer from an industry perspective. So it has to be a game changer in terms of the applications for the human beings that need to benefit from what 5G will bring. And so for Verizon, it's just core to our mission and core to who we are, is to use technology to drive that innovation to solve those big problems that exist.
That's so true. And even the discourse around the fourth industrial revolution, it often is about, technology for technology's sake, right? But there's an opportunity here to be able to leverage technology to solve for big global problems. I'm smiling because I think one of my dreams, as you know, is to travel into space, to be the first physically disabled person in space. And I imagine myself giving a speech to the United Nations from space using 5G technology. So we should probably have a follow-up conversation about that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
But you know what I love about it is that you can't just have the technology out there, right? You've got to create the ecosystem of innovators and small businesses who can actually harness it and who have the key insight to make a difference. That's why, we have the Verizon Forward for Good Accelerator, which is all about businesses that are founded or that are led by individuals with disabilities, and actually asking them to join us, to be a part of that accelerator program, to help us determine what the right solutions are and what our technology can do. Because we don't want to build it ourselves and say, don't you like what we gave you? We want to be in a place where we're leveraging the lived and real experiences of individuals to help harness that technology in a way that is for good, and in a way that's going to be scalable, and in a way that's going to have the right impacts in society. Because to your point, 5G for the sake of 5G or technology for the sake of technology is a non-starter. It's really about providing that technology to individuals who can help us determine how to best use it to solve the problems that exist. And that's what the Verizon Forward for Good Accelerator program is all about.
And what I love about the accelerator too, I think there's another layer of opportunity where entire industries and sectors can be enhanced and transformed as a result of those innovations that are birthed by founders and by innovators on the ground who are working on new initiatives, which is so exciting. And that's why I'm deeply committed to this work too, because I truly believe that, disability-based innovation will get us to the Sustainable Development Goals faster and in a way that's more expansive. So that's incredibly exciting. I love what Verizon's doing in this space.
So talk to me more about, you use the term a lot, disability-based innovation. Tell me more about what that really means. Like, what is your vision of that?
So I think my vision is probably threefold. It is, I think first, my goal is to redefine disability, right? The way that we talk about disability as not just being about isolation, neglect, trauma, which is the lived experience of so many hundreds and hundreds of people with disabilities all over the world, but to say that our lived experience as disabled people can actually be leveraged to not only improve our own lives, but be a benefit to all of humanity. I know we keep using the example of the drop curb, right? That it will enable me as a wheelchair user to utilize, to get from point A to point B, but that same drop curb can be used for parents with strollers and other things. I mean, that's a classic example that people point to, but things like the remote control and, the typewriter, all of these things were invented with the lived experiences of people with disabilities in mind. And I guess my vision is the next level of that, right? So, for example, because of my disability, I'm unable to physically use my hands, but opening a bank account requires a signature. Many social services require signatures, right, as a prerequisite to access that service. Imagine how we can transform financial services all over the world if we were to innovate around what is seen by society as a deficit, right? as a disability, if we innovated around that lived experience to not only facilitate access for people with disabilities themselves, but actually revolutionize the way that we interface and interact with one another, right? And so for me, that is what disability-based innovation means, is that we reimagine the end user, but in so doing in a way that leads to systems change.
Yeah. See, I love what you're saying, because let's go back to that 1
Yeah,
billion
billion
people,
people.
right?
Yeah,
It's so easy to not see.
yeah,
To not see people, to not understand needs, because we don't sometimes want to see who our customers really are,
Right,
right?
right.
And not that we have that problem at Verizon, but I
Right.
think in general, there's this sense of, well, who is the customer? And so are you finding that there just isn't deep research happening inside of the space to understand who the 1 billion are, to do the segmentation work, to think about the innovations that, very few companies probably have in their segmentation strategy, an understanding of, oh, within that group is a subset that I might want to, or that's a group. How do we change that?
You know what? It goes back to something you said earlier on in our conversation. I think there's a dimension around emotion. I think we need to go beyond seeing the customer as a data point.
Ah,
Because I think there's a fundamental assumption that people with disabilities, this 1.3 billion constituency, that these are people who don't really have full lives, who aren't a 30-something young man who wants to go out with his friends on a Saturday night and have a good time and access the joys of life. We don't really see this segment of society in that. We see them as maybe a data point, but we don't have a holistic picture of who they are as human beings. And I think that's where there's a real opportunity to sort of say that when we talk about 1.3 billion people, these are people with aspirations, these are people with fears, with anxieties, with the desire for self-actualization, right? And I think that is a very different way of articulating this segment than sort of saying, how do we make sure that they're included?
yeah,
Because it's not about inclusion. I think it's about transformation.
yeah,
And that could be a benefit, right?
Yeah.
So it goes back to what you're saying, leaning into the way that we take decisions. If we don't bring the emotion to the table, we miss a lot. I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, in my head, I'm like, yay, this is what we need to do. But I'm not always sure whether it's clear,
Yeah.
for folks.
Well, I think it's everything that we said up front, right? It's about, I don't want to just talk to myself.
Yeah.
It's about that willingness to go out and say, I'm going to develop relationships with people that I don't know. I'm going to develop relationships and expand my circle of friends to be inclusive, because I am incredibly curious
Right.
about other people, and I want to learn and I want to know. And that takes work and that takes commitment. And too often we don't want to do that. I mean, what I feel in my relationship with you is that I could probably ask you anything
Oh, anything.
about, your disability or different things, and you would answer the question, because I want to understand in order to think about, well, what can we do together? Not how can I help you, but what can we
Right.
do together, which creates a very different dynamic about how you engage with people, because that's what I do when I create new friendships, right? You get to know people, you figure out who they are, and then you figure out, well, what can we do together? And I think
And that's the new methodology,
Yes.
right? Earlier, like, what does new methodology look like? I mean, what you've just said, it sounds very simple, but it's so deeply profound and transformative. What can we do together, right? Because that's a kind of radical empathy, radical collaboration, to serve a goal that's larger than ourselves. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's really what it's about.
It's so interesting. I have a very good girlfriend, my best girlfriend, who suffers from vitiligo, right? So that's the disease in which you lose all the pigmentation in your skin. And so I've been with her on this journey for so long. And it's always interesting when we're just hanging out together. And, we have this conversation all the time about what we can do together and a respect for what has changed and what we used to could do, because she can't take full sun, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't change that ability to problem solve together.
Yeah.
And so I feel like we just so often want to limit kind of what relationships are because we want to be comfortable
Right.
and we want to make it easy. And I think it's a matter of, if you want to build inclusiveness, if you want to be different kind of leaders, it is that willingness to actually be really uncomfortable and probably be uncomfortable a lot, so that we can get to a space of building great things together.
But Rose, I also think that isn't there something to be said for the fact that we ourselves can be transformed by discomfort? I mean, I remember, growing up as a child in South Africa, I very often was the only wheelchair user in my school. So I was one of, the first batch of disabled kids who were enrolled in the mainstream education system. And what I often say to policymakers today when I speak with the world leader, whether it's at the United Nations or the World Economic Forum, the benefit of inclusive education, it doesn't just transform the kid with a disability, it actually transforms all the children, right?
Yeah.
Because I think about my friends and how they had the benefit of embracing difference early on. When we were kids, the only thing that they wanted to do was push me in my wheelchair and, see how fast they could push me. For me, that was hair raising, right?
Yeah,
Because I'm just like,
right.
they're going to tip me out of my chair. But in some ways, it was beautiful because the innocence of children who are so different coming together to collaborate, to learn, to play, that my presence as a disabled child was a benefit to me, but it was a benefit to my non-disabled counterparts. And
'Cause
they were transformed in the process.
you created normalcy.
Right.
And that's really what we're talking about here,
Yeah.
is how do we create normalcy?
Yeah.
Because when we do that, inclusiveness just comes along with it.
Right.
And that's the opportunity, my friend.
Oh, Rose, I love it.
So that's what we're going to do.
That's what we're going to do.
All
Love
right.
it. Rose, this has been an absolute joy
Thank
and
you,
delight.
Eddie. Thank you.
I count you as one of my mentors.
Aw,
I really do. And
Thank you.
thank you so much for your leadership, and I think for really paving the way for young people, but for all of us to really stand in our truth and lead with authenticity and to lead with vulnerability. And I'm just so glad to call you a friend and a mentor. So thank you for
thank you.
having this discussion
Oh,
with me.
thank you. Thank you for all that you bring to the space, for the fact that you live your authentic truth and you challenge us all to see you, to see others, to see ourselves, and to just think better about the kind of world that we are creating. So I appreciate your leadership as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.